Right, I'll get cracking. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this Labour Connect and Northeast Young Fabians event we've called Dirty Past, Clean Future, a Green Industrial Revolution for the Northeast. My name is Grahame Anderson. I am an employment barrister and chair of the Society of Labour Lawyers Employment Group, and it's also my pleasure to chair the Northeast Young Fabians. One of the reasons we set up the Northeast Young Fabians was because of a perceived lack of dialogue on important policy issues seen through a Northeast lens. Industrial policy is, of course, one such area. We've got a very proud industrial heritage in the Northeast, and that is, I think, still at the core of our identity as a region. Both of my own grandfathers were shipbuilders, and they were very proud of the work they did in the shipyards on the Tyne and on the Wear. And of course, the town I'm from, like many towns across our region, South Shields, was just as famous for coal mines as for shipyards. Now, plainly that form of heavy industry is history now. But I think about the jobs many of my friends from school now do. One of my mates from school now works for a company where he develops this very sophisticated software to help sports venues update their ticket prices by the second. One of the girls I went to sixth form with, who may well be on this call, is now a cancer researcher at Newcastle University. So for my own part, I think it's extremely exciting for us to reflect on the immense potential that we've got in the Northeast. Manufacturing, for example, accounts for a greater share of economic output in our region than it does elsewhere in the country. And we export goods to the value of something like 7.6 billion to the EU, 5.3 billion to the rest of the world. And in particular, and I'm sure this is something we'll talk about very soon, our region punches above its weight in what I call lead industries: life sciences, energy, advanced manufacturing, digital. Plainly, the Tories' mismanagement of coronavirus, their mismanagement of Brexit, poses a threat to the region's economy. But my own view is that there is great cause for optimism. Now, I could not have asked for a better panel of speakers to discuss this particular topic than the ones I'm delighted to be joined by. Chi Onwurah, as you will all know, I'm sure, is the MP for Newcastle Central and Shadow Minister for Digital, Science and Technology. Henri McDonald is the MP for Middlesbrough and Shadow Secretary of State for Employment Rights. And Henri Murison is the Director of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. I'm very excited to hear their thoughts on the industrial future of the Northeast, what the challenges and opportunities are, and hopefully what we might be able to do to help. So I'll ask each of them to speak for 10 minutes or so, and then we should have some time for questions afterwards. The chat function, I'm told, has been disabled, but the Q&A function is there. So you can write your questions there, and then I will pose them to our panelists once the talks are over. So thank you once again for joining us, and I'm delighted to pass over to Chi Onwurah.
Well, thank you, Graham. Thanks very much for that introduction. And it is great to be here. As I'm the MP for Newcastle upon Tyne Central, so no questions about football, please. But it is fantastic that there were so many young people, young Fabians on this call on a weekend. And one of the things that inspires me in these difficult times is the next generation of activists, so many working so hard to help the fight for a Green New Deal against climate change and a green industrial revolution that works for the North. And before lockdown, I spoke at many of the youth climate strikes in Newcastle, and the passion and urgency of young people there was really uplifting. And like you in the South Shields, I love Newcastle, and I love the Northeast, and I love our industrial heritage. My grandfather was a sheet metal worker on the Tyne, and it was growing up in the shadow of Stevenson, Armstrong, Parsons, and by the way, that is Rachel Parsons, the world's first female naval engineer and the founder of the Women's Engineering Society. But that was part of what inspired me to study electrical engineering and become an engineer, a chartered engineer. Now, I wanted to build things and make things which make the world better, and that is what we have done, in the Northeast for generations. Now, some try to say that these two driving forces, environmentalism and industry, are incompatible. That to support our industrial base, we must abandon our role as guardians of the planet, or vice versa. And I disagree. I believe that by being bold and ambitious, investing in sustainable manufacturing methods as part of a circular economy, with the next generation of passionate engineers and policymakers that believe in net zero future, we can build the green industrial economy that we need. There is no price that can be put on your future, but our future must include everyone. Momentum has really gathered behind this transformation. Labour introduced the Climate Change Act in 2008, and we were one of the first industrial countries to commit to strict targets on emissions. And the usual suspects complain that to this day that this goes too far. Although the Tories, of course, now say it was, act as if it was their idea all along. But since 2008, we have learned so much more about the process of climate change. And the warnings from the IPCC and even bodies like the IMF are that much more needs to be done much faster if we are to keep even keep below 2 degrees warming by 2050. And across the world, millions of people, hundreds of millions actually, are already suffering from the effects of climate change as lakes shrink, rivers flood, and farmland turns to desert. And you have conflicts in places in Nigeria which are actually, which are reported often as tribal conflicts. They are a consequence of changing landscape due to climate change. And it's the poorest, the most marginalized, and the disadvantaged who suffer most. And we can't allow the future to be something that only works for those with the money to move to higher ground. So I think, we have now an understanding of the problem. We are, those who recognize the problem, we are increasingly aware of what will happen if we do not act. So it is the time for action, and it's the time for real change. And that's why, it's time for a green industrial revolution that will also tackle the social and regional inequalities that we are facing and which the pandemic has exacerbated. The green transformation is a huge economic opportunity. A green industrial revolution would answer our duties on both these fronts. It would be both a massive mobilization of finance and labour towards decarbonisation, but also a rebalancing of our economy, greening production to create new jobs which are high scale, high wage, and high productivity and sustainable. And the North, and that's really an opportunity for the Northeast specifically. We are still the only region that exports more than it imports. The green industrial revolution is the chance for the Northeast to expand manufacturing, to grow the tech industry specifically in Newcastle that we have, to use our world-class universities and to drive up living standards, to give young people the opportunity to fulfill their potential. It's a chance for Newcastle. I know we have a spokesperson for the Northern Powerhouse, but it's a chance for Newcastle to become a real powerhouse. And in engineering, and one of the things which has always concerned me is the lack of women in engineering. And they talk about women, being more predominant, actually in lower paid, but also in what are called often called the caring professions. There is nothing more caring than saving the planet. Now, there's nothing more caring than re-engineering our production, our manufacturing, and our economy so that we can live sustainably. And so, last week, my colleague, our fellow Minister for Climate Change, Matt Pennycock, called on the government to take action and bring forward the ban on the internal combustion engine to 2030. And in Newcastle, one of my constituents wrote to me about problems with air pollution, largely caused by petrol vehicles. During lockdown, we felt how the air could be with less emissions. And the government's trying to pass the buck for this to councils, but we believe that government must take responsibility by supporting the rollout of electric vehicles and creating jobs by cleaning up our air. Newcastle is actually also a centre for battery technology development, and around the Hitachi and Nissan, we have the opportunity to be a hub for the next generation of electric batteries. So until the government gives emissions reduction to status it requires and acts, the UK is destined to remain off track for the net zero target legislated for just over a year ago. And we could, if manufacturing electric vehicle batteries could increase the number of jobs in the automotive industry by 50,000, but we need to make the investments to be a leading part of that. And and this all comes together or reflects part of us as Shadow Science Minister, our ambition to make the UK an innovation nation. And what that means, means in sort of in concrete terms, increasing our spending on research and development, which currently is about 1.7% of GDP, up to 3%. The government currently has a target of 2.4%. I think that's essential to meet net zero. But as well as that, it's about making, democratizing the benefits of science and technology. So not only so that they work for everyone, but everyone can participate in them as producers, actively. So that this innovation, and particularly green innovation, isn't something that happens sort of in ivory towers somewhere over there, but it's something that every kid from a comprehensive school in Newcastle can feel that they can be part of to make a difference. So we have to make many opportunities in our universities to support emerging sectors that have social value. And we want to see research working for the public good, bringing with it good jobs to the region with our universities and further education institutions, so that you can fulfill your potential to change the world in the Northeast. And I know that there's appetite for that. I know that there's appetite for a Green New Deal. I know that there are kids considering what GCSEs and apprenticeships they should be taking now, that in 7 or 8 times could be qualifying as bioscientists or carbon capture and storage engineers or green boiler fitters or battery gigafactory engineers, making a net zero economy happen. But for that, we need action. So my vision of our country's future is one in which smart, sustainable growth is harnessed to improve the lives and well-being of everyone. Economic growth is not an end in itself, but what matters is how that growth is generated and how the rewards are shared. And the green industrial revolution is an amazing opportunity for the Northeast to create hundreds of thousands of high-skilled, well-paid jobs, on the banks of the Tyne and the Tees and the Wear. We have to cut emissions, but this is not the burden that the Tories make it out to be. It's also the chance of a lifetime to make real change that will give working people healthier and happier lives and take control of all our futures.
Chi, thank you so much. Some very important points there, and I'm sure we'll come back to those. We've had a few questions. We'll hand over to Andy McDonald.
Thanks, Graham. First of all, are you hearing me clearly?
Yes.
That's good. Always a pleasure to be on a platform with Chi, because she's a proper scientist. So she does know her stuff, and it's a joy to have her on the front bench for her incredible input and insight. We're all claiming our shipyard rights. So can I just put on the record, I come from a family of Clydeside shipbuilders and shipyard workers. But the mother's side is the Irish influence that all came to Middlesbrough for the steel works. So I'm a true smoggy. So industrial issues are pretty well ingrained in more ways than one. But it's an actual job. And Graham, I do share your optimism. I absolutely firmly wedded to the notion that the northeast of England is so beautifully placed to take full advantage of making this incredible impact and changing our planet for the better, embracing the green industrial revolution. But as we say, we've got to make sure that it's people who benefit from this in terms of economic impact. I just think it's worth just reflecting on what we said 10 months ago in December 2019 as a starting point. We did settle a specific manifesto for the Northeast, the Green Industrial Revolution Manifesto for the Northeast. And we set out our ambitions to create 80,000 jobs with £9 billion worth of investments in green technologies of the future. And that would save 18 million tonnes of CO2 each year by 2030. And there were some specifics within this, and it's worth just commenting on one or two of them. We did commit to a steel recycling plant at Redcar. I mean, electric arc furnaces are going to play an important part of that ecosystem. How we've got in a situation where we export metal halfway across the world to be remelted. We're the biggest exporters in the developed world of scrap metal. And just a word about Redcar. Of course, we're hearing now of the Internal Markets Bill and the government's concerns about their ability to intervene because of the issues of state intervention. They could use the powers that they have. They sat on their hands and saw the Redcar steel plant collapse. I went across to Italy and spoke to people there at the other plant at Taranto. The Italian government intervened there, in Florange in France and in Germany. So I really just want to flag that up, that intervention in an industrial strategy is available to us, and it always has been within those limits. But we also gave our commitment to manufacturing to support the Dogger Bank wind farms. So there were direct commitments to invest in wind, home upgrades for insulation, EVs as Chi's alluded to, hydrogen, CCS, ports and fabrication, and plastics recycling, all in the Northeast. And on transport, when I held that brief for 4 years, the objective of reducing emissions was at the heart of everything that we did. So there was that transformational commitment on cycling and walking, building to £50 per head of population. We committed to bus re-regulation. I mean, obviously public transport's a big issue at the moment around the pandemic, but it will return. And we wanted to see the re-regulation of our buses to restore the routes that we'd lost, to electrify the bus fleet of our nation, and a rolling program of rail electrification within a publicly owned railway, and the creation of 10 national nature parks. So we said a lot, and Friends of the Earth ranked our manifesto as the most radical and ambitious of all the parties, including the Green Party. And you will remember that Keir made a very clear pledge to put the Green New Deal at the heart of everything we do. There is no more important issue to our future, he said, than that of climate emergency. So a Clean Air Act to tackle pollution locally, demand international action on climate rights. So it's at the heart of everything that we're doing. I just want to say a couple of things about carbon capture, utilization and storage. Colleagues have been committed to this as a concept for such a considerable time. And here on Teesside, we have the Teesside Collective, a group of international companies that's now morphed into something called Net Zero Teesside, which is deemed to be a nationally significant infrastructure project. And this has the potential to be transformational. Chi also made reference to us being considerable emitters. We are, in our region, we do make that contribution, but we've also got the solution, and people have been working on that for a very, very long time. It's now a consortium of 5 oil and gas companies, BP, Eni, Equinor, Shell and Total. And it's hydrogen, and it's BP that's leading as the operator. I've just got a concern about how this has come about and how it's structured. And I'll come on to that when I deal with some other matters as well. And it relates to the potential around hydrogen. We already produce 50% of the hydrogen in this country now from our region. But there is a massive opportunity in this regard. And we've got to think about how we're going to produce it. There is the process of electrolysis that's producing that's the hydrogen from splitting hydrogen and oxygen, electricity going through water. Chi knows more about this now than ever will. But it's there. But as I understand it, it would be difficult to build that to scale. So we may find ourselves in the business of very significant steam methane reformers, a huge industrial process that can play its full part. The opportunities are immense. People may be aware of the Northern Gas Networks project that set out H21. The focus was on Leeds because Leeds had converted its gas network into a plastic network, ready to receive hydrogen. That could have been, that can be the first city of any such scale that would be emissionless. But it ties in, obviously, with what you do with CCUS. That's critically important. The two things go hand in hand. But the emission contribution would be enormous. And of course, let's not forget the employment, skills and training opportunities that this would beget. There's many people, I imagine, will remember the conversion from town gas to natural gas. Well, can we imagine what that would be like if we were to make this transfer? The opportunities are enormous. And you're getting people like Worcester Bosch, who are producing their boilers now. They're getting ready. They would be ready to receive hydrogen. So it's a huge opportunity. But what about the social justice elements of this? Where are the opportunities? Kia also made another pledge to strengthen workers' rights and trade unions, and to work shoulder to shoulder with trade unions to stand up for working people, to tackle insecure work and low pay, to repeal the Trade Union Act, oppose Tory attacks on the right to take industrial action, and the weakening of workplace rights. So when I think about the North East and its industrial heritage, of which we're all so proud, and the industrial opportunities that are coming down the pipeline, we're looking at massive capital expenditure projects. And, you know, certainly on Teesside, you're looking at waste to energy plants. They're incredibly heavy in capex, but at the end of the process, we'll maybe have 30 or 40 jobs out of a £500 million piece of capital. Obviously, the economic hit comes with the construction of these significant plants. But what I'm quite disappointed about is about the failure to engage with working people to say how we're going to work this in terms of making sure that we've got the skills and we've got the pipeline of people coming through in many of these trades where we haven't done that, and we get into difficulties because of that failure to invest in recruitment. I'm also anxious that if we do embark upon these Green Industrial Revolution construction projects, that it draws in and includes as stakeholders working people through their trade union representatives, so that there is a charter for construction and there is a commitment for trade union recognition, and that nationally agreed rates of pay are adhered to across the piece. I want good industrial relations. I want good jobs. I want good homes and good lives for our people. But we can only do that if the benefits accrue to them and don't simply sit in the coffers of corporate entities. So the opportunities, Grahame, are absolutely immense for us in the Northeast. We have got a unique skill set and industrial heritage upon which we can draw. And I think if we go about this in the right way, the transformation for our region will be phenomenal. but it will not happen by accident. We've got to be in there shaping that future for ourselves. Thanks very much.
Andy, thank you so much. I just want to highlight two things that arise out of what you've said, lest I forget them. One is we in the Northeast Young Fabians are in the process of doing a review of the 2019 Northeast Manifesto. And one of the really important points that you've made there is how fantastically specific it was, rather than a sort of general, yes, we're going to have a green industrial revolution and that's going to be great. It was a plant at Redcar that will do this. It was the Dogger Bank specific investment program. And the second thing was, you mentioned trade unions, and I don't know if people have seen this. In as early as June, I think, TUC Northern were first out of the gate with a plan for a green recovery for the Northeast, which was very specific and very technical. And it's something that, if you haven't seen it, I think people would be really well advised to go and look at. Okay, I'm sorry to have cut in there. Henri, very keen to hear what you've got to say.
No, thank you, Graham, and great to follow Chi and Andy. And I suppose I give some reflections, I suppose, from a slightly economic-y standpoint, which is that, and I think where Andy finished is where I'd pick up, which is that our friends at IPPR North have done a lot of research into energy, as well as ourselves in particular, as a partnership. And what's really interesting when you look at the just transition is that this is both a burning platform and an opportunity. So there are many people who work in industries that are at risk from decarbonisation. So there are jobs that will be lost unless we act to be at the forefront of this field. So it is a massive challenge for us. And the parts of the country that are most exposed to these risks are places like the Northeast and the North of England more widely. And I think that hopefully really helps to focus the mind, which is that it's great that Nissan makes so many electric cars, but they still make a lot with combustion engines in. And that's the point, that, and there's a lot of their supply chain that make bits that go into cars that have combustion engines in. And so those were historically the parts of cars that were most valuable. And Chi rightly talks about the kind of opportunities around the particularly lightweighting of vehicles, which is something that the Northeast and the wider North of England has lots of capabilities in doing. There's a huge research opportunity, not just around batteries and technology, but actually around how you make cars lighter. And I think that's something rightly that I know Newcastle University and colleagues across Tyneside and Wearside have been looking at in great detail. So what I wanted to suppose to really reflect on is that point that this isn't just all good news, that we've got to think about those that will potentially lose their jobs in this transition, and how do we deal with the personal impact of that, and how those people feel they can benefit from the new jobs that are being created. And then the next point is really to reflect on where this sits in terms of a wider industrial strategy piece. And I think this week will be interesting in terms of how under new leadership, which I think is the strap line, or new leadership to give it its proper title, there's been a lot of debate about the Red Wall and the politics of how the election played out for Labour and the places that it lost seats. And Andy and Chi are two of the people in the party who talk a lot about the North-South divide and the economic unfairness of generations of what's happened through deindustrialisation to previously very prosperous parts of the country that are now some of the ones that are the least prosperous. And that journey has been incredibly difficult for those communities that have been affected by that. It hasn't always been the case that the party platform has been as concerned with those issues as I think that Chi and Andy may have wanted it to be. And that may be, I'm sure in the debate after these reflections, I'd love for people to tell me I'm wrong. And as someone who historically, and I think I'm now referred to as a historical figure in local politics in the northeast of England, used to be a big believer in this issue and how I ended up doing it now in my professional life rather than from a political standpoint. It always maddened me that in opposition for 10 years, that despite having most of the council leaders, despite having most of the MPs, the party centrally was never that interested in rebalancing the British economy in the way I think it could have been. So I think that is the territory that Labour nationally should own, but actually it's been left to good local government leaders and many of our region's MPs on the Labour side of the debate to put that case, very eloquently I would add. But I think it's time for the party leadership to make that a much clearer part of the platform. And if you respond to the Red Wall just by talking about patriotism, which I do think is actually quite a good theme electorally that Keir has obviously cracked, But patriotism and values are only half of the red wall debate. The other half is the economics and the reality of what the offer is of a Labour Party. And I think that the offer of a successful Labour Party in seats in the North East has to include these issues. Now, that's kind of obviously kind of almost assumed, I think, in this discussion, but I think we have to put it explicitly that this isn't just something that is a nice to do for the Labour Party or something that's actually just good for the environment. This is essential to the people who vote Labour for their own economic certainty and future. And it's essential for the Labour Party to have any chance of winning back the seats it lost in last December's election. And I hope that focuses minds, not just on this call, because if you've dialed into a Zoom on a Sunday evening to talk about decarbonisation in the northeast of England, then you're clearly probably on board with this message already. But I think others need to understand it. And it comes down to a point that when people talk about climate change, they often make it about values, and that's brilliant. But actually, this is about genuine economic interests. So hydrogen that Andy talked about is an industry that we will lead in the north of England, and Teesside will be at the absolute centre of it because of its existing production facilities. Cumbria, with the likelihood of new small modular reactors and other technologies, is another place you could probably expand your hydrogen economy quite successfully if you chose to go in that direction as a country. CCS, another technology Andy mentioned, is big money for the north of England. Do you mean, frankly, it is a huge economic opportunity. So in a way, yes, I agree with all the environmental reasons for doing this, but we also have to be really clear that this is good old-fashioned industrial policy, and it's green industrial policy, but it is fundamentally about jobs. It's not just about doing this because there are lots of ways, actually. You can buy French nuclear energy, and that's what actually the last end of the Labour government and much of this last decade has been about energy policy presupposing that we can buy more and more of our energy from Europe and just buy other people's green electricity. Well, as the north of England makes half of England's electricity, and that's a lot more than the people who live here, it's in our interest that we keep making our own electricity and not importing it from the French, bluntly. And so sometimes a green choice is not a good choice for the north of England. But if you get the economics, the politics, and the environmental thinking right, there's no reasons those three things shouldn't align. And I think that I would be really keen to see the Labour Party, not just through the regional manifesto, which I thought was a good start, but I probably would argue that where it was, if anything, didn't go far enough, was that it wasn't clear enough on what the R&D opportunities and assets that you might need, for instance, would be. Chi referred to those, but a credible kind of repositioning of the Northeast to lead the global change in how we generate, particularly energy. There are other elements of the decarbonisation journey, but I think energy is particularly something the Northeast leads in. That's got to be based on some really clear investments in R&D and in our catapult network. I think that was probably a little missing, because although it's a good aspiration to say you want to lead in green steel, and I would absolutely agree with everything that Andy said about that, the reality is we're a bit far away from where we need to get to in making that technology commercial right now. And what would make a big difference actually is all the big mega projects that Andy did such a good job when he was Shadow Transport Secretary from stopping the government from cancelling, like HS2, need to absolutely ensure they use British-made steel, but not just British steel, but over time, green steel. And those opportunities to use government's buying power to not only buy British, but buy green, and in that stimulate those plants to make them economic is key, because actually government's main role isn't actually subsidising new pieces of plant, because somebody will pay for that plant, right, if there's a market for the product. What government has got to do is shape the market. And as the largest customer for many of these commodities, in particular for steel, it's the power of the UK government as a buyer and what can be done through our arrangements through the trade union movement and with the current government for the time being and for the future Labour government to make those commitments real, so that we don't just talk about government leading a green industrial revolution, which is what the current government also talks about, but ensure that what actually happens is something that creates jobs in our regions, and in this case, particularly in the Northeast, where I think there is a very strong argument that in offshore wind, and particularly in the decarbonisation of the rail industry, whether that be through hydrogen or through electrification, as Andy also mentioned, the opportunities are significant in job terms for the northeast of England. And I would argue, as a recovering Labour politician, but not a current one, that we should lead with the jobs and finish with the environment, because actually this is about politics, not just about what's right. And if the Labour Party gets this wrong, it doesn't have an offer for the North East and for the north of England more widely in 4 years' time. And I would advise all of those involved in Labour politics, and including yourselves at the Young Fabians in the North East, to not just think about what the right policy is, but connect that into a retail offer that makes sense in some of the communities that did not choose to put their trust in Labour at the last election.
Henri, thank you very much for that passionate speech there. I'm going to open the floor to some questions, and when I say open the floor, I mean read out questions that people have sent in. We've got quite a lot, but I am going to selfishly take the chair's prerogative and ask the first one, if I may. And it's about this, Henri, and it's not just a question for you, but you spoke about the need for the public sector to shape the economy and to shape the market. It is a feature of British life that we are a tremendously London-centric country and a tremendously London-centric economy. What methods do you think there are to ensure that industrial policy as it is needed for the North East is decided upon by people who are sufficiently close to the North East? One answer, and I think this may well be the answer, is something that the Labour Party has certainly been talking about, which is a regional investment bank, which holds some very serious purse strings. Do you agree with that, all three of you, or are there other methods of having decision making closer to home?
No, and I think we've talked a lot, and Jim O'Neill, who's our vice chair, has talked in the context of the crisis about a patient capital fund that would be either pan-northern or regionalised in its delivery. That all sounds very sensible and middle of the road in the current climate, right? Because in an era where government is doing so much, things that sounded radical 5 years ago are now pretty middle of the road, sort of almost like accepted kind of very centrist policies, right? So I think there aren't many sensible economists who would tell you anything other than the fact that if you're going to spend huge amounts of money recapitalising existing businesses, many of which are pretty carbon intensive, the only legitimate thing you have to do is balance that with investment in emerging businesses that will, where you can't save businesses, create as many or more jobs. And that should be biased significantly towards the north and to decarbonisation. And I think what you allude to, Grahame, is something that triangulates the two. I would also give a sales pitch for devolution, because that's sort of my job, I suppose. It's not really my job, but I spend most of my time doing it. And I think that certainly it'd be a lot easier to develop an industrial policy for the North East if it wasn't just the Tees Valley, but all of the rest of the North East. So from County Durham to Northumberland, that had a coherent political geography for its devolution settlement. And then we need real power. So I don't think the powers that currently Jamie Driscoll, for instance, has north of Tyne will get the job done. So there are things he can do, and I would urge him to do, like invest in the National Centres for Data and the National Centre for Ageing to go a little bit beyond the green brief that you could do with the money he's got, and you could make those world-class facilities that would attract huge additional investment. And I think she was very right to talk about data, which is actually very important for decarbonisation because of where energy meets data. So I think the answer is twofold. It is significant amounts of new money that don't currently exist from the public purse, but with the intention that that generates in returns more than you put. So that's about making money for the government. It's not just about money for nothing, if that makes sense. But I also think it's about getting Devo on more sensible geography. And I think that, if I'm being completely blunt, I think the MPs in the Tees Valley are doing a good job in still talking about these issues, but there's a real challenge there that clearly industrial policy in the Tees Valley is led by a Conservative government and then a Conservative mayor who certainly talks the talk on these issues. And I think it's really important that the Labour Party is talking about nationally issues like hydrogen and CCS, because otherwise it's very hard for local people in those communities to see that the Labour Party is on their side if others are leading on some of these agendas themselves. And I think that creates a real burning platform for Labour nationally to really take a lead on issues like hydrogen and CCS, because electorally, in the North East terms, they cannot afford to take their eye off the ball, because others will take over the debate on those issues and will very much run with it if Labour doesn't talk about those issues.
I think Henri makes a very, very valid point about the perception of people leading on these areas, whereas in reality, Labour politicians have been banging on and trying to progress these agendas for years, but we do run the risk of being seen to be detached from it and not being in the vanguard of promoting these concepts. So I take that on board entirely. The difficulty we have, certainly in the Tees Valley, is that the absence of any engagement with the community more broadly as to what this is going to, how it's going to benefit them. The way Henri talks is absolutely right about the benefits to them economically. That is absent from the debate at the moment. I'm really disappointed that I've been unsuccessful in communicating sufficiently so that everybody's under no doubt that the import of the Labour Party over the last many years has been to regional investment. That was why there was the commitment to the regional investment banks. That's why there was the commitment to the rewriting of the Treasury Green Book, to look at infrastructure in industry and across the board, that drew away from the obvious benefit cost ratio arguments that could facilitate any development in the southeast of England. We were putting that at the heart of what we were trying to achieve. I think it's just a failure if that hasn't been communicated more adeptly. On the issue of the democratic relationship, of course, I was one of the people who campaigned for a Northeast Assembly many years ago, and the people of the Northeast rejected that by 2-1. I regret that bitterly. We did in the Tees Valley, the 5 Labour authorities as they then were, negotiated with the Chancellor of the day, George Osborne, to secure the best deal we could on the basis that these powers would develop. But I share Henri's analysis that I think we do need to look on a more pan-northeastern basis. I am absolutely committed to drawing power and spending ability away from Westminster and Whitehall and putting that into the regions. And I would refer people to my white paper on the railway, which actually spoke to devolution in a very fundamental way. And it was the north of England, it wasn't the northeast of England, it was the north of England, approximately across the footprint of transport for the north, where the power and control would lie. But just finishing on the regional investment bank, we look to Germany and see how they have their regional investment banks focused on economic development. We don't have that. We have massive banks lending massive amounts of money to massive organizations. We've got to break out of that mindset, in my view, if we're going to have that real betterment to the northeast of England. Thank you.
Thank you both for that. We've had a question from Adam Ellison, who is a councillor in South Tyneside, and he says the green industrial revolution is critical to meeting demands of the climate change emergency. How do we take steps to ensure that learners of today gain the skills to enter this sector and get those green jobs? And how do we support those already in careers to take the step into this growing sector? We don't want to be left behind. Who wants to answer that?
Well, I'll start and say that it's a really important question, and it's good that it reflects both learners of today and those who are studying now, but also everyone who is. We need to have a much greater emphasis and accessibility for lifelong learning, and I think in terms of those who are working, those who are learning today. We need to see greater investment in support for green skills and for green apprenticeships. We had it in our manifesto. We had 100,000 climate change apprenticeships. I think Ed Miliband has talked about an army of climate change apprentices. We need to ensure that every qualification and roles and support, and also what young people see at school, the examples of engineering, the examples of building, these are all informed by the challenge of climate change. The opportunity and the challenge for those who are already working, and unfortunately those who will not be working, particularly as a consequence of of the pandemic, we are going to see, and we haven't mentioned this before, but in the Northeast, we are going to see high unemployment. There's a possibility, and even likelihood, at the end of the furlough scheme, of mass unemployment, and that is an opportunity for retraining and for access to skills. So access to training, access to training that people can afford. And for those in work, it can be working with unions, and Andy mentioned the number of jobs created with the changeover around town gas. That was done with the unions to a huge reskilling sort of mission. The Prime Minister talks about moonshots. Unfortunately, she can't deliver, but we really do need to see the accessibility for lifelong learning, for the green industrial revolution, and also we have a fourth industrial revolution. Our Shadow Minister for Digital, we're seeing a huge rise in technology skills requirement at the same time as traditional sectors like retail are facing unprecedented challenges. So, reskill, upskill, access to lifelong learning.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on that point about retraining?
No, I just endorse everything that Chi has said. I think she's hit it absolutely perfectly. I think we'd all agree that one of the deficiencies over many decades has been our failure to properly train in advance and make sure that we had the requisite skills coming through our education and skills and training systems. I recognise that a great deal of attention is being paid to that, but it has been, in my view, a failure in generations past. I come from an area where British Steel and ICI gave apprenticeships across the board and trained legions of people for several generations. We lost that relationship. It is being built back up, but we need to press that ever more so. And Chi is absolutely right about the commitment to lifelong learning. This is, if we're going to have people being able to transfer their skills from one sector to another, it's critically important that they have the education and training mechanisms to achieve those transitions.
I think one just very practical example, Grahame, I would give of how this works in practice. You're currently seeing Northern universities led by Chris Day, who chairs the N8 group of research universities, working with other institutions like Teesside to work with FE colleges to look at how, for instance, in hydrogen and in terms of decarbonising the supply chain and other industries, we can link up world-class research across the north in decarbonisation with the skills opportunities. So we need to think about skills at the same time as we think about research and development, because the two are both prerequisites for businesses wanting to locate here and set up. And I think particularly in the hydrogen economy, we want to have a whole group of PhD researchers all coming to Teesside from across the north of England, because we think that's a very practical way of also bringing the benefits of those really top-end universities that are world-class, so that they benefit communities that haven't historically had access to those institutions, even within the region. So I think that levelling up point, right, that's what real levelling up looks like, right? It's not spending a few quid on someone's high street. It's preparing the kids of those families for the jobs that they will be facing in 10 years' time. And the distinction between tarting up someone's high street and what I would consider to be genuinely rebalance the economy is a million miles apart. And people need to be calling out those who claim their interest in the Northeast, who say that it's all about things that I would consider to be pretty banal, bluntly, economically speaking. And that argument, I think, needs to be had in much more assertive terms over the next few months.
Thank you, Henry. We had a really interesting question from Chris Wong-Sosaputro, who says, Henry made a very relevant point about linking green energy to the economics. What is the general attitude of the people in the Northeast about green energy? What is the level of awareness in the link between green energy and economics? I think that's a really interesting question, because of course, your point wasn't just about the economics, but it was about the electoral economics, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, no, and I think if you said to people, do you want small modular reactors, they might squint at you a bit funny and go, what's one of them? If you said, do you want thousands of more jobs in local SME manufacturing companies making parts for nuclear power stations that could go to places like Hartlepool, where otherwise you'll let a nuclear power station close and replace it with nothing else, which is current UK government policy, right? We have nothing to replace that fleet of reactors when they get switched off. So neither will we have the electricity nor will we have the jobs in a place like Hartlepool. And that's, I think, the kind of very honest conversation we need to have with people, because it isn't all about wind farms and offshore wind. Lovely as it is, that only gets you some of the way. And we've got lots of that in the Northeast, and we'll win in terms of servicing. We'll win in lots of ways from the expansion of offshore wind, but that's not going to get it done on its own. Neither is that going to get us to net zero, nor is it going to get us the number of jobs we're going to lose otherwise in other areas of the energy and wider industrialization economy. And the key point is, if you don't have access to cheap electricity, you can't make your hydrogen because you don't have enough electricity to do it. And you also can't attract those industrial occupiers who want access to cheap, plentiful electricity, something the Northeast has had now for generations, but is on the verge of losing because all of it will be sucked in to our electric cars and it won't be available for industrial users. So that kind of, that micro system, right, which is that energy is the prerequisite for an industrial economy. Do you mean that's stuff that I don't think we talk about enough? Certainly within the Labour Party in my lifetime, we don't talk enough about how you need to think about where your energy is coming from, where your labour's coming from, because that is the perspective that every other industrial country that's planning its economy takes. And the reality is we need to start planning our economy. We need to plan decarbonisation in a sensible and ordered way. And that means working with the private sector, but it means being really clear and empowering local leaders to make the investment decisions that the private sector alone cannot take and is not geared up to take, because one business cannot invest for a whole cluster the way you need for CCS or for the other technologies we've been talking about this evening.
Thanks.
Just add to that. Sorry, Grahame, just add to that. I think if there's a discussion about awareness and about communication, if there's any gap in that, that's down to politicians, and it's people. We have to do our jobs correctly to make sure that we're having the correct conversations. But I think we would underestimate the awareness that's out there. Just think of the impact that Extinction Rebellion has had around the whole climate crisis debate. They did shift things. You know, people like Greta Thunberg did promote these issues, but the original point, and Henri made it very eloquently, we've got to make sure that speaks to people's economic aspirations and ambitions to have those decent jobs, being able to afford to rent somewhere or buy somewhere to live in, and to have those good lives that we all want for ourselves and our families and our communities. So we've got to get that language right. We've got to have those proper conversations and make it real. It's about real people's lives, and these are the opportunities. And I think anything that if we don't do that, it's a failure on the part of politics, quite frankly. And we've got to focus on it and get those messages well communicated and well understood.
Chi, I know you've got to jump off in just a moment, but we've had quite a technical question from Julian Jones, and I think it's for you. He says, concern has been raised about sourcing raw materials for batteries. Can you reassure us that this can be overcome? And what other manufacturing sectors do you envisage being benefited by a green industrial revolution?
Great, thanks so much. Yes, I'm sorry I have to go. Not to sort of endorse what both Henri and Andy said. I don't about the attitude to green energy. I'd also say that when I could go out door knocking, which I'm not doing how to do, I was really noticeable when he was talking about green industrial revolution. Often it was people's kids who were asking them questions. So parents were saying to me, my kid's really angry about this, or my kid's been happy about this, or at school this is happening. And so whilst it might not be something that's at the forefront of everyone's mind, the fact is that young people are really aware of this. So in terms of batteries and sourcing of them, that's a great question, and that's one of the reasons why we need to have sustainable and transparent supply chains, because there are certain battery technology is do this. Battery technology is fascinating. There are lots of different and evolving, and there are lots of different battery technologies. But there are challenges with some of the rare earth materials and some of the batteries. There's also the fact that it is right now totally not a circular economy. So the batteries are, and I did a debate about this in the House with the minister, who unfortunately didn't seem to understand what the debate was about, but about recycling of batteries. Because right now, the way that they're getting recycled, a lot of the car batteries, is we send them to Germany and we burn them in a huge bloody furnace. And we don't actually recover most of the minerals. So one of the things that Newcastle University is looking at, and I'm trying to support them in this, is to have battery recycling in the northeast. It's not easy, it's not simple, but it can be done more efficiently than we're currently doing it, and that obviously reduces the demand for new materials and elements where there are concerns that sometimes are coming from countries who are in conflict and haven't got a sustainable means of maintaining them. But then battery technology is also moving on. So I think it's really important that we have transparent supply chains and we have more of a recycling and circular economy, particularly in car batteries, as we seek to really ramp up their production. When it comes to other, there was so I was on a call before yesterday where I was talking about pharmaceutical manufacturing. I grew up at 250 yards from a big pharma factory, which was then taken over, and then sold, and then the capacity went outside of the country. We strategically, we need a strategic pharmaceutical manufacturing capability, and we should be supporting that. And then there's obviously new technologies in life sciences. As we want our, instead of having plastic bags, we're going to have biodegradable biotech bags and other materials used from carbon-based plastics. And that is a whole, if we can be at the forefront of developing the technologies, we should be at the forefront of manufacturing them. And then then you get, there's all kinds of new chemicals, and I think biotech, pharmaceutical, as well as kind of green tech and home IoT devices. Those are all areas where I'd like to, and batteries. Those are all areas where there are opportunities that we should be able to support.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm going to end it there, but can I just say, first of all, thank you, of course, for your political and the insights you've brought from your experiences, but the amazing technical expertise we've seen on display as well. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining us. I think you'll agree it's been a very illuminating discussion, and I maintain my optimism from the start. So thank you all once again, and no doubt we'll be working with you in the future.
Thanks very much, Grahame. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everyone. Thank you, Grahame.